The Galactic Council chamber hummed with the harmonious frequencies of 17 different species, each delegation positioned according to millennia-old protocols that had prevented wars, fostered trade, and maintained peace across 3 spiral arms. Ambassador Vexthara of the crystalline hegemony adjusted her resonance to the perfect pitch of diplomatic courtesy. The Zephyrian delegation's bioluminescent patterns pulsed in measured, respectful sequences. Even the notoriously volatile plasmawraiths maintained their containment fields at precisely regulation opacity. Then the humans arrived. Ambassador Jake Miller stumbled through the ceremonial entrance, his briefcase spilling its contents across the sacred threshold of first words, a crystalline platform that had remained unblemished for 3,000 years. Documents scattered like autumn leaves, and Jake's desperate attempt to gather them resulted in him accidentally stepping on a Zephyrian's ceremonial tail tendril. The chamber fell silent, not the respectful silence of diplomatic protocol, but the horrified silence of witnesses to sacrilege. "Sorry, so sorry," Jake called out, his voice cracking the delicate harmonic balance that the crystalline delegates had spent 20 minutes establishing. He lunged for his papers, inadvertently triggering the emergency containment protocols when his elbow bumped the Plasmawraith delegation's control panel. Alarms shrieked. Emergency barriers slammed down. The carefully orchestrated first contact ceremony, planned for 18 months, devolved into chaos in exactly 47 seconds. Temporal entity Sigma observed from outside the flow of causality, its consciousness existing in the spaces between moments. To Sigma, time was not a river but an ocean, and it could see all possible currents simultaneously. In 847,293 potential timelines, this moment played out differently. In 847,292 of them, the ceremony proceeded flawlessly. In those timelines, the galaxy ended within 6 months. Only in this timeline, the one where Jake Miller appeared to be the most incompetent diplomat in human history, did the stars continue to shine. 3 days after the disastrous first contact, Jake sat in his cramped quarters aboard the human diplomatic vessel Endeavor, staring at the growing list of his apparent failures. The Galactic Council had filed 17 separate complaints, 3 demands for his immediate removal, and 1 request for a formal investigation into whether humans were actually sentient. His assistant, Dr. Sarah Chen, paced the small room like a caged tiger. "Jake, I've run the scenarios 1,000 times. There's no way someone could accidentally violate that many protocols without trying." "I wasn't trying," Jake protested, though even he wasn't entirely sure anymore. The incident seemed to follow him like a malevolent shadow. Yesterday, he'd somehow triggered a religious schism among the hive mind collective by sneezing during their unity chant. This morning, his attempt to offer a traditional human handshake to the ethereal consortium's representative had apparently been interpreted as a declaration of blood feud. "The Zephyrians are calling you the Chaos Bringer," Sarah continued. "The crystalline hegemony has composed a 17-hour harmonic lament about the shattering of protocols. And don't get me started on what the Plasmawraiths are saying. Their language doesn't even have words for the level of diplomatic catastrophe you've achieved." Jake slumped in his chair. He'd wanted this assignment so badly. First contact with an established galactic civilization was supposed to be the pinnacle of his career, not its spectacular end. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I should resign." "No." The voice came from neither Jake nor Sarah, but from the air itself, a sound like wind chimes made of starlight. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees, and the edges of reality seemed to shimmer. Temporal entity Sigma materialized, its form a constantly shifting geometry that hurt to look at directly. "Ambassador Miller, your resignation would be inadvisable." Sarah grabbed for her sidearm, but her hand passed through empty air. Jake, strangely, felt no fear, only a deep, bone-deep recognition, as if he'd been waiting his entire life for this moment. "What are you?" Sarah demanded. "I am an observer," Sigma replied, its voice now coming from everywhere and nowhere. "I exist outside your temporal flow, watching the currents of causality, and I am here to tell you that Ambassador Miller is not incompetent. He is the most competent being in this galaxy." The revelation hung in the air like a discordant note. Jake laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Competent? I've managed to insult every major galactic power in less than a week." "Yes," Sigma agreed, "and in doing so, you have prevented the convergence event." The entity's form shifted, and suddenly the room filled with images, not on screens, but floating in the air like three-dimensional holograms. Jake saw the Galactic Council as it should have been. The ceremony proceeding flawlessly, treaties signed with perfect diplomatic precision, humanity welcomed into the galactic community with open arms. Then the images changed. The Zephyrian delegation's bioluminescent patterns revealed hidden weapon systems. The crystalline hegemony's harmonic frequencies weren't just ceremonial, they were scanning human neural patterns, mapping weaknesses. The plasmawraith's containment fields weren't for protection, they were for concealment. "The Galactic Council," Sigma explained, "is not what it appears. 3 of the major powers have been planning humanity's subjugation since your first radio signals reached their space. The ceremony was meant to be a trap, a way to study your species before the invasion." Sarah's face went pale, but Jake's mistakes prevented them from gathering the intelligence they needed, Sigma finished. The Zephyrian's tail tendril contains neural sensors. Ambassador Miller's accidental contact triggered a feedback loop that damaged their scanning equipment. The harmonic disruption prevented the crystalline hegemony from completing their neural mapping. The emergency barriers blocked the plasmawraith's stealth reconnaissance drones. Jake stared at the floating images, watching alternate timelines play out like a cosmic horror movie. In every successful diplomatic scenario, humanity was enslaved within months. Their technology stolen, their world strip-mined, their people reduced to a labor force for galactic expansion. "But how," he whispered, "how could I know to do all that?" Sigma's form pulsed, and for a moment Jake could swear he saw something almost like a smile in the entity's impossible geometry. "You don't know, Ambassador Miller. You feel." The next morning brought a new crisis. The Galactic Council had demanded a formal apology ceremony, complete with ritual offerings and ceremonial prostrations. Jake stood in his dress uniform, hands shaking as he reviewed the 17-page protocol document. "Remember," Sarah whispered, "bow exactly 45 degrees to the crystalline delegation. Maintain eye contact with the Zephyrians for no more than 3 seconds, and whatever you do, don't touch anything belonging to the plasmawraiths." Jake nodded, but even as he walked toward the council chamber, he felt that familiar sensation, a tingling at the base of his skull, like the moment before lightning strikes. It was the same feeling he'd had before every accident, every diplomatic disaster. The ceremony began with painful precision. Jake bowed to the crystalline delegation, 46 degrees instead of 45, just enough to trigger their harmonic sensors into a feedback loop that would prevent them from recording the proceedings. He maintained eye contact with the Zephyrian representative for 4 seconds, long enough to activate their species' involuntary truth detection response, which would reveal their hidden agenda to the other council members. And when he reached for the ceremonial peace offering, his hand, accidentally, brushed against the plasmawraith containment field. The explosion of light and sound was spectacular. Emergency protocols activated across the chamber. In the chaos, Jake glimpsed something that made his blood run cold, hidden weapon emplacements retracting into the walls, stealth ships decloaking outside the station, and the shocked expressions of 3 delegations whose carefully laid plans had just been exposed. Temporal entity Sigma appeared beside him, invisible to all but Jake. "Do you see now? Your instincts are not human instincts. They are temporal instincts, the ability to sense the currents of causality and choose the path that leads to survival. But I don't understand how. You don't need to understand, Sigma interrupted. Understanding is a function of linear time. You operate on a level beyond that. You feel the weight of unintended consequences, the pressure of potential futures. Every mistake you make is your unconscious mind preventing a catastrophe you cannot consciously perceive. The aftermath of the ceremony was unlike anything in galactic diplomatic history. The hive mind collective, whose neural network had detected the hostile intentions of the three conspirator species, demanded an immediate investigation. The ethereal consortium, whose energy-based perception allowed them to see through the plasmawraith's deception, called for emergency sanctions. Within hours, the conspiracy unraveled. Hidden fleet movements were detected. Intercepted communications revealed plans for humanity's enslavement. The three species that had seemed most offended by Jake's diplomatic failures were exposed as the architects of an invasion that would have begun the moment the treaties were signed. Jake found himself in the unprecedented position of being simultaneously the galaxy's worst diplomat and its greatest hero. The irony, said Counselor Zethkri of the Ethereal Consortium, is that your species' apparent incompetence may have saved us all. The conspirators' plans depended on surprise and coordination. Your unique approach to diplomacy disrupted their timeline so thoroughly that their alliance collapsed before it could act. Jake sat in the council chamber, no longer the bumbling human who had stumbled through the ceremonial entrance. The weight of revelation had changed him, or perhaps simply revealed what had always been there. What happens now? Now, said Counselor Vexthara, her crystalline form resonating with what Jake had learned to recognize as respect, we begin again. But this time, we do so with honesty. The Galactic Council had been purged of its hostile elements. New protocols were established, not the rigid ceremonies designed to facilitate deception, but flexible frameworks built on transparency and mutual respect. Humanity was offered full membership, not as subjects to be studied and controlled, but as equals whose unique perspective had proven invaluable. Months later, Jake stood on the observation deck of the new human embassy station, watching ships from dozens of species dock in peaceful commerce. The galaxy had not ended. Trade flowed freely. Scientific knowledge was shared openly. The future, for the first time in eons, was bright. Temporal entity Sigma materialized beside him, its form more stable now, as if the resolution of the crisis had somehow anchored it more firmly to this timeline. Do you regret it? Sigma asked, knowing the truth about your abilities. Jake considered the question. The knowledge was both a gift and a curse. He could feel the currents of causality flowing around him, sense the moments when his intervention might be needed. But he could never be certain whether his actions were preventing disaster or causing it. He had to trust in instincts that operated beyond conscious understanding. Sometimes, he admitted, it would be easier to believe I was just clumsy. Easier perhaps, but not honest. Sigma's form pulsed with something that might have been amusement. Your species calls it gut instinct, the ability to know something without knowing how you know it. Most humans have traces of this ability. You simply have more. Why me? Why does any evolutionary trait emerge? Because it was needed. Your species stands at the threshold of galactic civilization. The old powers, the established hierarchies, see you as a threat to their control. They will try again more subtly, more carefully. And when they do, humanity will need individuals who can sense danger before it manifests, who can prevent catastrophes through apparent incompetence. Jake nodded, understanding. He was not unique. There would be others like him, humans whose temporal instincts would guide them through the labyrinth of galactic politics. They would be called clumsy, incompetent, disastrous, and they would save the galaxy through their failures. The transformation of galactic diplomacy was gradual but profound. The rigid protocols that had once governed interspecies relations gave way to more flexible approaches that acknowledged the chaotic nature of genuine communication between vastly different forms of life. Jake found himself at the center of this revolution, no longer the bumbling ambassador, but the architect of a new diplomatic philosophy. His mistakes became case studies in unconventional problem-solving. His instinctive violations of protocol were analyzed, and where possible, codified into new frameworks for cross-species interaction. The Miller Doctrine, as it came to be known, emphasized adaptability over adherence to rigid rules. It recognized that true diplomacy required the ability to sense underlying currents of intention and respond to them, even when that response appeared to contradict established procedure. Dr. Sarah Chen, now promoted to Director of Temporal Diplomatic Studies, published papers on the phenomenon of precognitive instinct in high-stress negotiations. Her research attracted scholars from across the galaxy, eager to understand how human incompetence had succeeded where traditional diplomacy had failed. The key insight, she explained to a gathering of galactic diplomatic scholars, is that Ambassador Miller wasn't operating on conscious knowledge, but on temporal intuition, the ability to sense the consequences of actions before they manifest in linear time. This suggests that effective diplomacy may require not just knowledge of protocol, but sensitivity to the deeper currents of causality. The exposure of the conspiracy had consequences that rippled across the galaxy. The three hostile species, the Zephyrians, a faction within the crystalline hegemony, and the Plasmawraith military caste, faced internal revolutions as their populations learned of their leaders' deception. The Zephyrian homeworld erupted in bioluminescent protests that could be seen from orbit. The crystalline hegemony's harmonic unity shattered into a cacophony of competing frequencies as different factions debated their future. The Plasmawraith's rigid military hierarchy collapsed as younger generations rejected the expansionist ideology that had driven their species for millennia. From these upheavals emerged new governments, new philosophies, new approaches to galactic citizenship. The species that had once plotted humanity's enslavement became some of its strongest allies, their populations grateful for the revelation that had freed them from their own oppressive leadership. Jake watched these transformations with a mixture of satisfaction and unease. His temporal instincts told him that the immediate crisis had passed, but they also whispered of future challenges, subtler threats that would require equally subtle responses. 5 years after first contact, the Academy of Temporal Diplomacy opened its doors on a neutral space station at the galaxy's political center. Jake served as its first director, tasked with identifying and training individuals across multiple species who showed signs of temporal sensitivity. The students were an eclectic mix, a young ethereal whose energy patterns fluctuated in response to future events, a hive mind drone whose connection to the collective occasionally picked up temporal echoes, even a reformed crystalline whose harmonic frequencies could detect causality disturbances. Temporal diplomacy, Jake explained to his first class, is not about predicting the future. It's about feeling the weight of potential consequences and choosing actions that guide events toward positive outcomes. You will make mistakes, apparent mistakes. You will be called incompetent, clumsy, disastrous, and you will save lives through your failures. The curriculum was unlike anything in galactic education. Students learned to trust their instincts over their intellect, to embrace uncertainty rather than seek control, to find success through apparent failure. It was a philosophy that challenged every established norm of diplomatic training. But it worked. Graduates of the Academy prevented 3 potential wars in their first year of service. They diffused trade disputes that could have destabilized entire sectors. They identified and neutralized threats that conventional intelligence services had missed entirely. As the academy grew and temporal diplomacy became an accepted field of study, temporal entity Sigma began to reveal deeper truths about the nature of time and causality. Your species, it explained during one of its increasingly frequent visits to Jake, is not the first to develop temporal sensitivity. Throughout galactic history, there have been individuals who could sense the currents of causality, but they were always isolated, their abilities dismissed as luck or intuition. What changed? Jake asked. The scale of the threat, Sigma replied. The conspiracy you prevented was not an isolated incident but part of a larger pattern, a cycle of expansion and subjugation that has repeated throughout galactic history. Each time, established powers seek to maintain their dominance by crushing emerging civilizations. Each time, the galaxy stagnates. The entity's form shifted, showing images of ancient civilizations that had risen and fallen, their potential snuffed out by the same forces that had threatened humanity. Your species represents something new, not just individual temporal sensitivity, but a collective potential for it. If properly developed, humanity could break the cycle entirely, creating a galaxy where growth and change are embraced rather than feared. The true test of temporal diplomacy came during the Nexus Crisis, a trade dispute between the Silicon Collective and the Organic Alliance that threatened to split the galaxy into two hostile camps. Traditional diplomats had spent months trying to negotiate a solution, but every compromise seemed to make the situation worse. Jake arrived at the Nexus station with a team of Academy graduates, their mission seemingly impossible: prevent a galactic civil war with no formal authority and no clear plan. The negotiations were a disaster from the first moment. Jake's team violated every protocol, offended every delegation, and turned what should have been a formal mediation into complete chaos. Within hours, both sides were demanding their removal. But in the chaos, something remarkable happened. The rigid positions that had deadlocked the negotiations began to shift. Offended delegates found themselves defending their opponents against perceived slights. Violated protocols forced impromptu discussions that revealed hidden common ground. The breakthrough came when Jake, in an apparent fit of clumsiness, spilled coffee on the central negotiation table, a table that, unknown to anyone, contained hidden recording devices planted by extremist factions seeking to sabotage any peaceful resolution. The short circuit that followed not only destroyed the surveillance equipment but triggered an emergency evacuation that forced all parties into the same shelter. In that cramped space, with their formal roles temporarily suspended, the real negotiations began. "It's remarkable," observed Counselor Zethkri, who had witnessed the entire process. "Your team's apparent incompetence forced everyone to abandon their prepared positions and engage in genuine dialogue. The very chaos you created became the foundation for understanding." The success at Nexus Station marked a turning point in galactic civilization. Temporal diplomacy was no longer seen as an experimental technique, but as an essential tool for navigating the complex challenges of an interconnected galaxy. Jake found himself in the strange position of being simultaneously the galaxy's most respected diplomat and its most feared one. His reputation for causing diplomatic disasters preceded him, but so did his track record of turning those disasters into unexpected successes. "The paradox of temporal diplomacy," he explained to a gathering of galactic leaders, "is that it requires us to embrace failure as a path to success. We must be willing to appear incompetent in order to achieve competence, to create chaos in order to find order." The philosophy was spreading beyond diplomacy. Scientists began to experiment with temporal research, allowing their investigations to be guided by intuition rather than rigid methodology. Artists explored causality aesthetics, creating works that seemed to violate conventional principles but somehow achieved profound emotional impact. Even military strategists began to study the principles of temporal thinking, learning to sense the deeper currents of conflict and respond to them in ways that prevented rather than escalated violence. On the 10th anniversary of first contact, temporal entity Sigma appeared to Jake one final time, its form more solid and defined than ever before. "The cycle is broken," it announced. "For the first time in galactic history, the forces of stagnation have been permanently defeated. The galaxy will continue to grow, to change, to evolve." Jake felt a deep satisfaction but also a sense of loss. "What happens to you now, to your observations?" "I am no longer needed as an observer," Sigma replied. "The timeline has stabilized in a configuration that promotes growth rather than stagnation. My role now is different, not to watch, but to guide." The entity's form began to shift, becoming less alien and more familiar. "You're becoming human," Jake realized. "Not human," Sigma corrected, "but something new, a synthesis of temporal awareness and linear existence. I will live within time rather than outside it, experiencing causality as you do, but with the memory of what I once was." As Sigma's transformation completed, Jake saw not an alien entity, but a being that was somehow both ancient and newly born. The first of a new kind of consciousness that could bridge the gap between temporal and linear existence. The galaxy that emerged from the transformation was unlike anything in recorded history. Trade flowed freely between species that had once been enemies. Scientific collaboration produced breakthroughs that benefited all civilizations. Art and culture flourished as different forms of consciousness learned to appreciate and learn from each other. At the center of it all was the Academy of Temporal Diplomacy, now expanded into a full university with campuses on dozens of worlds. Students from across the galaxy came to learn not just the techniques of temporal sensitivity, but the philosophy of embracing uncertainty and finding strength in apparent weakness. Jake, now in his 60s, served as the university's chancellor emeritus, his hair gray but his temporal instincts as sharp as ever. He still occasionally caused diplomatic incidents, old habits died hard, but now they were recognized for what they truly were, course corrections in the flow of galactic civilization. "The greatest lesson of temporal diplomacy," he told his final class before retirement, "is that competence and incompetence are not opposites but different aspects of the same phenomenon. True mastery lies not in avoiding mistakes, but in making the right mistakes at the right time." As he spoke, Jake felt the familiar tingling at the base of his skull, his temporal instincts detecting some distant disturbance in the flow of causality. Somewhere in the galaxy, a new crisis was brewing, one that would require the intervention of a temporal diplomat. He smiled. The galaxy was in good hands. The future, for the first time in eons, was truly unknown, and that was exactly as it should be. Thank you for listening.